In episode 1, we used the modern definition of empathy, the ability to feel what another person is feeling, to feel the same joy, to feel the same hate. That is the modern definition of empathy, right? Now, last time we also introduced 3 groups of people associated with empathy. The saviors of empathy, the white liberal women, the angels of empathy, defined as whomever the white liberal women view as oppressed, and the devils of empathy, white men, or anyone acting in a way that supports white supremacy. White supremacy is again, of course, defined by white liberal women who, through an unidentified genetic quirk, are the only group of people incapable of practicing white supremacy. So how did we get here? Or better yet, how did empathy get here? You ask yourself, have you ever actually felt what someone else is feeling? Be honest. Is empathy real? Or is it, as some have said, a made-up New Age term? Is empathy good? Or is it, as some have said, the fundamental weakness of Western civilization? Well, considering that the people that said these things are white men, we know their comments are just supporting white supremacy. I'm sure if we look at the origins of empathy, we will find that it is inherently good, grounded in reality, and its definition has been consistent through the decades. Going back centuries, I'm sure. Or at least going back 1 century. Or at least going back to the start of this century. Why don't we take a look? Let's check Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary from 2001. The very start of the 21st century, and most certainly modern. Empathy, the imaginative projection of a subjective state into an object so that the object appears to be infused with it. That's the first definition of empathy. In 2001, just 25 years ago, this century, Merriam-Webster says the first definition of empathy is some imaginative projection of a subjective state into an object. Have we been lied to about empathy? What actually is empathy? Well, let's go back to how empathy was defined at the start of the 20th century. How was empathy defined in 1900? Oh, wait, there was no such thing as empathy in 1900. Well, how can that be? The word empathy derives etymologically from the ancient Greek word empatheia. What is empatheia? In modern context, empatheia is tied to bias, malice, and even hatred. Wait, let me double check that. It's got to be a mistake. No, it's true. Hatred. Even Wikipedia says so. So the ancient Greek source of the word empathy is tied to bias and hatred. How about that? Must be an accident. And while that may not sound like the modern definition of empathy, it does sound like modern empathy in action. Regardless, though, that's just where the word came from, not the concept. The concept of empathy originated from a different source, from the German term Einfuhlung, or feeling into. And when have the Germans ever led us astray? Einfuhlung was first coined in the 18th century, but the idea of Einfuhlung was more fully developed by German philosophers in the late 19th century. Einfuhlung described the projection of feeling and movement into works of art, shapes, things in nature, inanimate objects. For example, have you ever looked at a mountain rising up before you and felt yourself rising with it, feeling as if you are rising with it? Have you ever felt that? Me neither. But some late 19th century and early 20th century German philosophers did. Now, Einfuhlung didn't become empathy right away. It was initially translated in 1902 by English psychologist Edward Titchener as aesthetic sympathy in Baldwin's Dictionary of Philosophy and Psychology. And if you haven't read Baldwin's Dictionary of Philosophy and Psychology, you haven't lived. So empathy was initially an abstract form of sympathy. And the intent was not to improve upon sympathy, as modern empathy seems to seek to do. It was simply to come up with a word to describe how psychologists, with too much time on their hands, project their feelings into inanimate objects. If matter was indeed undifferentiated mind, it was likely that inanimate objects possessed psychic qualities. This is the type of gobbledygook that early researchers into empathy spouted. Perhaps Malcolm X should have said, "We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. We felt ourselves into Plymouth Rock." Now, eventually, Einfuhlung was translated into English as empathy in 1909, again by Titchener. Apparently, Titchener made a veritable career out of trying to come up with English words for Einfuhlung. But this time, he utilized the Greek word empatheia to get empathy. Now, Titchener's use of the Greek word empatheia as the basis for empathy met with some understandable criticism. Some called it a vile word, others an unfortunate attempt to force a meaning on the English word which is not expressed by the Greek. Essentially, Titchener was projecting a meaning onto a word that had a totally different meaning. Projecting. So it would seem that projection and empathy were connected from the beginning. Now, at this point, we can see that empathy has in its origins feeling, projection, narcissism, abstraction, not rational, humanizing non-human or inanimate entities, psychic and mystic perceived connections between mind and matter, and perhaps most importantly, early definitions of empathy were tied to transformation. One could escape the self through empathy by transforming into the object. Now, other than the connection to feelings, that doesn't sound a whole lot like the modern definition of empathy. In fact, the tendency to try to humanize the inhuman seems like the opposite. Modern empathy seems to make humans more human. Right? That's what Tolstoy said. Right? So how did the definition of empathy evolve? Over time, it transferred from inanimate objects to people. Empathy was utilized as a way to identify schizophrenics. Schizophrenics being those who seem to have a complete lack of empathy. Now, post-World War II, empathy appeared more often in the popular press, largely due to the growth in psychology. Famed radio and television announcer Arthur Godfrey appeared on the cover of Time magazine in 1950 with the caption, "He has empathy." Soon after appearing on Time magazine, Arthur Godfrey fired someone on air. Apparently, he had empathy and a lot of latent anger. Probably a coincidence. In 1955, Reader's Digest described empathy as a word that only recently made its way out of the psychological laboratories, describing it as an ability to appreciate the other person's feelings without yourself becoming so emotionally involved that your judgment is affected. Feeling something without feeling something, apparently. Now, as you might expect, empathy eventually became tied to perceived deficiencies in white American culture. That's starting to sound more modern, driven in large part by psychologist Kenneth B. Clark, who wrote things such as, "American culture caused people to hate. White insecurity is the engine for prejudice. White American society was built around capitalist greed, and that if blacks were indeed to obtain equal rights, it would be a, quote, psychological calamity for the average American white, who would have to find other scapegoats or to face again the intolerable state of their own emptiness." In 1979, Clark wrote that the only thing that will save us is a universal increase in empathy. No word on whether he said this while looking in a mirror. So what does empathy mean today? Well, let's review how it was defined back then in the early days. Projection, abstract, narcissistic, not rational, humanizing the inhuman, and transformation. How does it work today? Well, here's an example. A white liberal woman projects, in an abstract and wholly irrational way, her own paradoxical combination of narcissism, insecurity, and self-hatred onto a person or persons whom she views as subhuman. And oftentimes, she will in fact transform herself into that person in the name of empathy. The truth is, empathy never lost its connection to the original Greek. Perhaps Titchener sensed that. In 2002, it was said, "There is no empathy that is not projection." Now, even though the definition of empathy really hasn't changed from its early days, it clearly has picked up a connection to white supremacy. But empathy can actually be connected to just about anything these days. anything that is that a white liberal woman deems it should be tied to. For example, empathy has been called a psychological basis for democracy, which means there must have been no democracy prior to the 20th century, and lack of empathy is therefore a threat to democracy. Others say there may be benefits to developing eco-empathy today as we rush headlong toward climate catastrophe. So we see empathy tied to climate change, or whatever it's called these days. So what about those who would criticize empathy and call it a made-up New Age term? Well, if one were to think rationally in an unbiased manner, one would conclude that empathy is indeed a made-up New Age term. However, by the rules of empathy, one must be irrational. So, in the spirit of empathic irrationality, no, they are wrong. We can in fact say that empathy has always been and always will be, and we can define it however we want. Empathy is infinite. Empathy is beyond the bounds of time. Please like and subscribe, and join me for the next episode, How Empathy Works for Evil. Thank you.